Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're joining us. We're going to start in just a few minutes here. Again, we're thrilled to have you attend our webinar entitled, What Creates an Environment of Innovation at Work? And we're looking forward to your participation. And let's just get started here with a prayer. I think that would be the best way for us to start. And so would you join me for a moment of prayer? Lord, you teach us to be thankful and grateful for all things. And for many of us, this past year has been a sequence of various trials and testing. And yes, we embrace your word, where you tell us to consider it all joy when we encounter various trials of many kinds, because we know that the testing of our faith produces perseverance. And we want perseverance, Lord, to finish its work with us and in our organizations, so that we might be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So help us create environments where our teams can be innovative and flourish, and give us wisdom as we seek to shepherd the flock that you've entrusted to us. Please speak through us today. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. Thanks. And over the next few minutes, we'll introduce our research on creating an innovative culture, and then we want to hear from our two leaders on who are leaders of innovative organizations, and I'll conclude our time with 3 practical steps to create a more innovative culture. At the end of our webinar, we'll be presenting a free resource, actually 3 free resources, and a special offer that I know that you'll be interested in. So today, you'll get a chance to participate in a poll and a Q&A session. So please be ready and engaged. And if you'll take a moment to look at the right-hand side of your screen where you'll see the chat room, and I see most of you have already figured that out. So feel free to type in your questions as they come up, because if you're like me, by the time the question and answer period comes, I've forgotten the question I was going to ask. So please put your questions in, and they'll be managed by our own producer and my executive assistant, Sarah Mistrek from Phoenix, Arizona. So thanks. But let's talk about you. You're wondering, well, who is it that may be on this webinar? First of all, let me say, we want to honor you, the attendees of today's webinar. Welcome. We consider you friends and colleagues in ministry. We've worked with many of you. We're grateful that you have invested this time with us today. We're pleased to see that individuals from 12 different countries have registered for this webinar. We have a well-rounded group of Christian nonprofits, churches, and Christian-led businesses. Examples of leaders who are registered include mission sending organizations, rescue missions, Bible societies, development ministries, churches, Christian higher education, Christian schools, C12 leaders, and Christian businesses, amongst others. And we've been honored to work with many of you, and deep down I know that you want the same thing, to steward the people and the organizations that God has entrusted to you. And as we think about that, what a year it's been. Here we are in March 24th, and this past year has been a time of trial for many of us. Externally, we've all experienced a quick shutdown. Some of us are still in shutdown in other parts of the world. We've transitioned our workforce to be largely remote. We've experienced a summer of racial tensions, demonstrations, political turmoil here in the United States, and growing economic disparity and uncertainty for many of us. Internally, inside, many of us experienced emotional upheaval from physical distancing from family and friends and workmates, increased anxiety and fears from the virus, and restrictions from worshiping together as a community in our churches. Working mothers have had the stress of supervising their children while trying to keep all of their work caught up and trying to keep their loved ones safe. We've all been tested in our leadership. Who can say that there hasn't been a time where they haven't felt maybe a little confused or frustrated? I know I have. We have great compassion for leaders working in this environment. We work with you and other leaders every day. Over the past year, we've held debriefings for employee engagement survey results. We've coached leaders on next steps. We've done Zoom focus groups with employees. We're providing training and other culture building programs and resources. We've been working with Christian camps, for example, that have had to lay off a majority of their staff just so they can survive to serve Christ another summer. Leaders have been stretched to innovate for their ministries and organizations just to survive, let alone thrive. We don't want to use the pivot word anymore. We've overused it, yet we know that to continue to move forward, to build the kingdom, we must innovate. At BCWI, we've researched the key difference makers between organizations that are likely to stagnate and those that will reinvent themselves and thrive in the midst of this uncertainty. We also have discovered again that during the pandemic, these words are especially true, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. A toxic culture will stop innovation in its tracks every time. So we've designed this webinar to help you with practical tools to create a workplace culture that's innovative and sustainable, and to help guide us on this journey and to improve the level of innovation in your organization. Let me introduce today's panel. I've had the privilege to introduce two innovative leaders and leaders of organizations with flourishing cultures, I might add. They are Kelly Jones. She's Apartment Life's COO and is a member of their leadership team, and she's kind of an industrial engineer at heart and loves to innovate. And for her, that means redesigning processes and creating software automation to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. And speaking of innovation, Apartment Life has decided just last December to go completely virtual forever. She and her husband live in a small mountain town outside of Colorado, just west of Vail, and she enjoys mountain sports, including snowboarding. BCWI has worked with Apartment Life for 18 consecutive years. Also joining us is Jeff Lockyer. Jeff is the senior pastor of SOUTHRIDGE Community Church, an innovative, cause-based, multi-site church in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is in the Niagara region. Jeff has a strong voice for innovation and employee engagement in the church world. He's the board chair of the Global Leadership Network in Canada and has served in many roles in the Global Leadership Network in the United States. We've worked with Jeff at SOUTHRIDGE for 8 straight years, and he's been a frequent guest on our Flourishing Culture podcast. Jeff is also the author of a book coming out later this year called Finding Our Way, and I've read a preliminary copy and would recommend it to you. Kelly, Jeff, thanks for joining us. And I'm Al Lopez, the co-founder and CEO of the Best Christian Workplaces Institute. And since our start in 2002, we've had the privilege of serving over 1,000 churches, Christian nonprofits, and Christian-led businesses. Prior to working at BCWI and founding it, I've led the Seattle and Portland offices of a global human resource consulting firm. Live here in Seattle with my wife, Kathy, who's joining us today, and many of you have talked to. And I'm also the co-founder of a Christian ministry that educates rural poor indigenous children in the highlands of Guatemala called the Nicholas Fund for Education. It's been a great pleasure to also host the Flourishing Culture podcast, and I've written a book that will be published next January. I'm really looking forward to this, called Flourishing Culture, 8 Keys that Boost Employee Engagement and Well-Being, and that'll be published by University Press. So welcome everybody, and especially welcome Jeff and Kelly. You know, our vision is that Christian workplaces set the standard as the best, most effective places in the world, and shouldn't we? And we do that by equipping and inspiring Christian leaders just like you to build flourishing workplaces. And our goal is by 2030 to have 1,000 flourishing Christian workplaces in the year 2030. And this year we have less than 100. So please join us as we seek to have 1,000 flourishing workplaces in 2030. I think that's the way Christian organizations are going to change the world. But let's start talking about innovation. You know, our new research has pinpointed and confirmed at least one key difference maker between organizations likely to stagnate and those that reinvent themselves and thrive in the midst of uncertainty. The catalyst for organizations whose engaged employees perform, collaborate, and excel, even under pressure, is leadership's competence, willingness, and freedom to innovate, or creating a workplace culture that fosters innovation. We have found that an organization's culture is the key difference maker. A culture will facilitate the generation of new ideas and implementations, find improved ways to do things, and create better processes and routines. So as I told you earlier, this is where you begin to participate. So if you'll look on the right-hand side of your screen, would you please reflect for a couple of seconds on where your organization is with innovation? And on the right-hand side of your screen, choose which of the 5 levels you would select to describe innovation in your organization today. So go ahead and let's see what people in our that are participating say about what level they're at. And it looks like it's going to be level 3. We make advancements to our service offerings. We've got a couple answers where they really innovate to change the way that people live. Oh, that's exciting. And I'd say that's a bell curve, wouldn't you say? That is a bell curve. We only have one that says that we resist change. I'm glad to see that. 9 answers that we adapt minimal changes. Yeah, so most of you are in that we make advances in our of our service offerings. Great. Oh, all right. Well, let's go on. That's fascinating. You know, over periods of time, innovation has been the key to organizational sustainability. That is the ability to introduce something new, different, or better to meet the needs of the others in the ever-increasing changing world. And that's what we're all about, serving others. And as Christian-led ministries and businesses face the challenges of our current environment, innovation is more important now than ever. The health, economic, and social challenges in our culture are unprecedented. The world needs Christ now more than ever, is the way I like to think of it. An organization's ability to innovate in order to meet the new realities of our environment is crucial. Some might ask the question, why is innovation important? Well, we believe innovation is vital in the workplace. It helps the organization make changes more rapidly in order to provide a better connection to the shifting needs of those that we serve. This can lead to even bigger opportunities that we have experienced in the past, and I think we're all looking for those. We believe that when an organization has an innovative culture, it will grow more easily. And we've seen this just as an example with churches on online giving. Innovative churches have moved to online giving over the years, and now when the pandemic has come, people have been forced to stay at home, and yet the church, rather than passing the plate, these churches are in good shape and continue to meet their financial needs. So that's just one example. So what does our research tell us? Well, these 2 things primarily. One, when some employees with creative confidence, or let me start this over. You know, there are some employees with creative confidence and ambition that tend to be more innovative. We recognize that. But our research tells us that the workplace culture plays a large role in setting the stage for employees to innovate at their best. In general, there's a strong correlation, or just in English, there's a strong relationship between innovation and engagement. And on average, organizations that have a flourishing culture score 1.5 out of 5 points higher than those that are toxic. I mean, that's a huge difference. Our data highlights that the actions of leaders, such as modeling fairness and integrity, humility, building trust, in combination with communication, like exploring reasons or explaining reasons behind decisions and conducting activities openly and honestly, significantly impacts the culture of innovation. Leaders make a difference in the culture of innovation. Of our 8 Flourish model factors, which many of you are familiar with, innovation most strongly correlates with healthy communication and inspirational leadership Coming in third is outstanding talent. We're going to go over that in just a second. Our data aligns with other research as well, that inspirational leadership and the culture of involvement are the most predictive of employee innovation. So what's the bottom line? It's that organizations that involve staff and employees in decision-making and value their input score highest in innovation. And to be sure that we're up to date with the science of organizational development, we partner with a PhD program at the Seattle Pacific University, a Christian university here in the Seattle area. And because innovation is so crucial to organizational sustainability over time, we ask the question right at the top of the screen, what are the items in our engagement survey that most correlate, have the strongest relationship with our question, employees at my organization are encouraged to experiment and be innovative? And those of you that have participated in our survey know that question. And another way to think of correlation, again, as I mentioned, is, again, the strongest relationship between two items. So these questions on the screen show the strongest relationship with innovation. There are 3 questions under the category of healthy communication, as you see. In summary, when an organization seeks and acts on employee suggestions and involves employees in how their work is done, those are key links to innovation. Then there are 6 questions in our inspirational leadership area, questions that are closely related to innovation. These have to do with the style of leadership. We call it inspirational leadership. Others call it transformational leadership. You might call it servant leadership. It's when a leadership is transparent, humble, has high integrity, communicates openly, is a competent leader, and creates high levels of trust with employees and others outside the organization. These leaders create a culture of innovation. So it's innovative organizations that also have talent management programs that make sure they promote the most highly capable employees. Now, some employees are more prone to being innovative, such as those with higher creative confidence, or those who are more ambitious or achievement focused. However, regardless of these individual differences, the workplace culture plays a large role in setting the conditions for employees to innovate. That's what the academic research is telling us as well. We also did a literature review to find out what the academic research tells us. And the first conclusion suggests that innovation occurs when employees are engaged and rewarded for innovating, similar to our findings. And also that inspirational leadership inspire and support innovation. So let's get practical. We have searched our database for a couple of the most innovative organizations that we've worked with. And we've looked at the scores on this question on innovation, and we've picked 2 of the highest scoring organizations to help us talk about this. Again, Apartment Life and Southridge Community Church are 2 of them. So Kelly, take it away. Tell us a little bit about Apartment Life and innovation at Apartment Life.
Sure. Thanks, Al. Appreciate just being here with you guys today. When Apartment Life was created, actually 21 years ago this month, we were really the first of our kind. And our founder, Stan Dobbs, he's one of those people that's just naturally wired for innovation. And so he came up with the model to provide a community building program to apartment communities. And in our original program, it was always a team of 2. And they physically moved into the community and lived there. And they provided a program that created community among the residents and cared for residents. So they would do things like plan pool parties, Saturday brunches, get neighbors out of their apartments and get to know each other. They would welcome new residents. So if you moved in, they'd go knock on your door and just introduce themselves and welcome you to the neighborhood. And then as they got to know people, they could care for them, whether it's fun celebration like birthday cards or congratulations, or praying and supporting you during times of need and crisis. And for apartment owners, if residents love where they live, they're more likely to renew their lease and share their positive experience online, which we know drives a lot of things these days. And so for the apartment owner, the program we provide provides a tangible ROI to them. Now, on the apartment life side, we believe that God created us for community. But unfortunately, we live in a world that's very isolated. And so the program gives us as believers an opportunity to love and tangibly care for our neighbors. Now, in true Stan Dobbs fashion, he's already gone on to innovate and create two other sister organizations to Apartment Life. The first one was Lionheart Children's Academy, which leverages churches to provide quality year-round childcare. And the second was Skylark, which also leverages churches to provide summer camps for school-aged children. So as I mentioned, Apartment Life is 21 years old this month, and I've had the opportunity to serve here for a little over 17 years. And as I reflected over those years with respect to innovation, I realized we've gone through 3 different distinct seasons. That first season, as I mentioned, we were one of a kind. And so Stan was very open of like, hey, just go figure it out. Like, there is no playbook. We got to create it. So we definitely were in high innovation during those early years. And as we started to see like what actually worked or didn't work, one of my early projects when I started was to go around and document the best of the best. And that really came our first version of best practices and standards. Well, in our second season, we had leadership who highly valued those best practices and standards. And now standards and best practices are great. I highly value them. And during that season, the way that we went about it and the degree to which we valued them really ended up stifling innovation. And because the national office kind of held and enforced those best practices, what happened is the majority of the organization would look to us as a few people to solve all the problems. And it honestly just didn't work very well. So in our current season, we're working hard to thread the needle and really figuring out the balance between what needs to be standard, kind of like the Chick-fil-A sandwich, and then what's open to that personal innovation and flair. And even on those things that we think need to be standard, like offering a standard excellent product to our client, that's still open to innovation. If our client doesn't like the chicken sandwich anymore, like we need to talk about that and figure out a different way to serve them well. Part of also threading the needle is we want to balance innovation with excellence. And so we also are trying really hard to innovate as an organization in a more structured and paced way. And that's just based on lessons learned. We've just learned that our people can only metabolize so much, and they can't be excellent at something if that something keeps changing on them and they're always in learn mode. So that's kind of where we are in this existing season. And so also, as I looked over those seasons, I also recognized that we've hit different growth plateaus over the years. Even though we've had more and more clients who want our services, we were ended up saying no a lot. And sometimes that's because what they wanted wasn't exactly what we provided. Other times it's because we couldn't find that team of 2 who wanted to move into the community. Either we couldn't find them at all, or we couldn't find them quickly enough, and the client would kind of give up on us. So in our current season, our CEO, Pete Kelly, started asking the question, how could we say yes? And the spirit behind his question wasn't that, like, we still want to be discerning and have wisdom, but if we wanted to say yes, how would we do it? And that question just really got our creative juices going and allowed us to think outside the box. And we started experimenting and asking, like, does it really have to be a team of 2? Do they really have to live on site? And so we experimented with single coordinators living off site to see, could they still create community effectively? We started playing around to see if we could serve low-income housing. Now, in low-income housing, community is still important, but the needs of the residents actually tip more heavily towards care. And it's a level of care that we traditionally just don't have, we're not equipped to provide. So it made us think about, could we partner with other organizations to come in and provide services like after-school tutoring or resume writing classes or ESL classes, right? And that's been very successful. And, you know, this line of thinking, I'm going to use the dreaded pivot word, allowed us to pivot during COVID and really transform our program that in the past was highly dependent on face-to-face interactions into a program that could be done virtually or with no contact. And so these questions and these experiments really allowed us to have record growth both the year prior and the year during COVID, which we were obviously super excited about because we thought maybe we'd lose a ton of clients. So with this record growth brought other domino effects, right? And so we started to realize that our current org structure just wasn't as effective as it was, because at the time, our organization was pretty flat and all of the people reported up to our CEO, Pete Kelly. Well, with more growth means more regional leaders, and Pete just realized that he was getting spread way too thin. At the same time, those of us at the national office who were managing kind of those day-to-day operations, we were also either helping develop or supporting those who were developing those experiments and new service options. So we were also getting spread pretty thin. And so what we've done over the last couple of years is slowly bring in a divisional structure, which has provided divisional presidents to help share the leadership responsibility with Pete. And it's also created an entirely new division to focus on strategic initiatives, which is just our way of saying innovating on new service options. So this innovation, even within our org chart, has allowed us to focus on being excellent in both existing and new service options. Now, if I were to take a step back and kind of boil down what I would say has helped department life be the most innovative, I would say we believe it all starts with feedback is a gift. We need everybody department life. It's essentially the body of Christ. We need all your gifts, your skills, your experience. We need you to bring all of that to the table. And we marry that with our core value of real. We don't want you to tell us just what you think we want to hear. We want to know your real feedback. And we want to know it when we're asking, and we want you to feel the freedom to share even when we're not asking, because we don't always know if or when we should be asking, right? And we start setting the stage for that at new employee orientation. And then as employees bring us feedback, as leaders, we work really hard to be open-handed and to not have any sacred cow. So even if I was the one that helped create the chicken sandwich, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, they don't like the chicken sandwich anymore, I want to be open and willing to hear that, because if I'm defensive and challenging, at some point, people are going to stop telling me the feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, because they're going to feel like I'm not listening and hearing them. And so we really want to have that posture. If it's not working, let's get it all out on the table. Let's figure it out together. Now, from a process perspective, I'm sure many of you guys do annual strategic planning. We do as well every year. We do SWOT analysis with the goal of boiling it down to 2 priorities that we want to innovate on organizationally next year. Now, the thing that might be different for us is instead of just leadership doing that SWOT analysis in that process, we have a multi-step process that involves the entire organization. So we start at the team regional level. Every team and region does their own SWOT analysis. Then all the regional leaders in a division come together and share what their teams, the feedback, they synthesize the information for the division. And then all 6 divisions, those leaders get together. Same thing, we share what the divisional feedback was, and we ultimately come up with those 2 priorities as an organization. Now, this process does take longer, but we believe it results in a better solution because it allows everybody in the organization to speak into it. And it provides buy-in because their jobs are probably going to be impacted by the innovation that comes out of those priorities. We know as well, once we have those 2 main priorities that we're going to innovate on, we know that other needs and ideas are going to bubble up throughout the year. And as those things happen, we really look to our leadership peer groups. And those peer groups have kind of organically come up through that new divisional structure. And if you remember, in that season where we kind of stagnated innovation, people were looking to just a few of us at the national office to solve the problems. Well, now we're looking to those peer groups because they have proximity to the problem. They know what the problem is. They understand the urgency or lack thereof as it relates to everything else going on. They also understand where their team is and can their team even metabolize more change right now. And so we look to them to bring proposals, bring recommendations to the leadership group, and we put a lot of stock in what their recommendations are. As I mentioned, we're always trying to define what needs to be standard, what is pretty much open at any time. We just think that's healthy to set expectations so everybody's on the same page and just it's known what how we want to proceed. And then probably the last thing is when we have what we think is a good idea that will impact the whole organization, we really encourage experiments first. And that's just lessons learned of not going, across the whole organization, but instead doing pilots with either one person or one region or whatever it might be to prove out, is it really a good idea? And if it is, the experiment and the pilot allows us to, get the bugs out and fine tune so that when we do go across the whole organization, we can do so in an efficient and streamlined way. And we all know that not every experiment is going to be successful. And so if it ends up that it really wasn't a great idea, we still celebrate the idea, the creativity, the hard work that went into even trying it out. And we take those lessons and we just, bundle them in to the next experiment where it makes sense. So that's really apartment life in a nutshell of just who we are and how we like to innovate.
Oh, that's great, Kelly. Thanks. And I really like what you said. Feedback is a gift. Let's be real. We'll talk about that even more. To be open-handed. One of the words that really comes through as I listen to you is the word listen. How you really listen through surveys, through feedback. You want honest, real, as you say, feedback, and I like the broad process of the way you involve really almost sounds like all of your employees in the strategic planning process and how things bubble up from that standpoint. And this is what we found, quite frankly, in COVID, is that leadership teams have because of COVID and decentralization, or I should say remote working from home, they've taken all the decision making into their leadership team, into the conference room, and they've stopped kind of that process of getting feedback from across the organization. So that's an important step. Thanks. All right, now Jeff Lockyer, take it away, Jeff.
Awesome, thanks, Al. And I was scribbling copious notes to Kelly's presentation as well. Hopefully, I'm learning something here too. Real privilege to be together with all of you, and I hope that the value that I can add is from what I would believe to be actually a less innovative perspective. When Kelly says that apartment life started with Stan Dobbs and he was just a machine of innovation, I don't perceive myself to be like that. But these days, we lead what I believe to be quite an innovative church community. And as I reflect on that, how we became innovative without necessarily being innovators in the traditional sense, that's what I hope to tap in on a little bit today, because I feel like in our case and in our story, our innovation is much more the product of convictions than it is creativity. It's much more the product of convictions than it is creativity. And so I'm going to kind of wind out a little bit of our story, and I hope you can follow along. I actually pastored the church that I've grown up in since I was a 10-year-old kid. Our church started in 1980 with some people my parents' age who wanted to do church a little bit differently. And so they planted this small country church in the rural part of the city of St. Catharines in the Niagara region, as Al talked about earlier. By about the mid-1990s, though, they were at a bit of a crossroads because the pastor was desiring to retire. And with some difficult situations with some search committees, they looked around and had a different idea. They saw that among their leaders and board members and whatever, kind of their option A in all of their private business worlds was to hand the family businesses over to their kids at that stage in their lives. And so if that was option A for them as private businesses, why wouldn't that be option A as a church? And so they embarked on this kind of formal process to kind of hand the keys of the family business of sorts over to some of us who'd grown up in the church. And so me and some buddies started to take over in the mid 90s, and one thing sort of led to another. And in the first few years, we were contemporizing some things, and people were being drawn to our community, and we were reaching people for Jesus. And we had all of the kind of, I would say, the ABC, attendance, building, and cash kind of metrics that you could share with your pastor buddies. But all of a sudden, we read a book that asked, if our church up and disappeared, would anyone in the surrounding society even notice? And that question haunted us, because surrounding our church at the time were just grape vineyards as far as the eye could see. And so we felt like no one was actually being really affected. We weren't really affecting the society that we lived in because we were so detached from it. And so back in that day, we took a step of faith. Instead of expanding on our existing building to address some of the congestion issues, we sold it and we relocated to about a mile from the downtown core of our city, the city of St. Catharines. And with the hopes of putting ourselves in proximity to more of our society's needs, we could start to be a presence in making a difference in them. And so we relocated back at the beginning of 2004. And we started to kind of partner with some compassion and justice agencies and started to develop some of that musculature as a church community, until one day we started to become a partner with a ministry that served homeless people. And we became the Sunday night site for housing homeless people in the city of St. Catharines. And we did that for a couple of years, where all of a sudden the mayor of the city then approached us and asked if we would open our building to accommodate homeless people 24/7 for the summer months that this program wasn't running. And at that point, we'd already been doing it for a couple of years and realizing the power of these unlikely friendships with homeless people. And so as a church community, we agreed to do that, and we haven't looked back since. We're in this St. Catharines site of our church community for the last 15 years or so. We have run the Niagara region's largest homeless shelter 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, out of our church building. Well, as cool as that was, it didn't stop there. In fact, it only started there because we continued to grow numerically. And in addressing those congestion issues, we started to explore this idea of going multi-site. But what was so cool there is when we started to have the public meetings around going multi-site, the first and the most pervasive question that our congregation asked us was, in these new Southridge locations, what would the shelter equivalent be in those other churches? What would the kind of compassion and justice flavor or focus become? And so all of that drove us to a whole different way of launching Southridge sites, where these days, you can see on the screen, we now launch our locations around what we call anchor causes. Anchor causes, which, like the homeless shelter equivalent, are the initiative of compassion and justice that defines each of our Southridge locations. And so now, in addition to our St. Catharines location that focuses on the anchor cause of homelessness, we've got a Vineland location about 20 minutes west of St. Catharines that focuses on the anchor cause of serving migrant farm workers who come seasonally from the Caribbean. And then about 20 minutes south of us, we have our Welland location that focuses on soul support families and low-income families in that neighborhood. And so rather than our sites being defined by a building or by a worship time or by those more attractional kind of metrics, if you speak the language of church, we've actually defined our sites in a much more missional way and made that shift from a more attractional church to a more missional church by becoming oriented around these anchor causes. So much so that back before we relocated to St. Catharines, we had next to no dollars invested in operationalizing any investments in compassion or justice at all. But these days, the budget that we just approved for 2021 invests over 70% of our church's resources into operationalizing this kind of ministry. And so for the last 15 years, this has been a dramatic shift, not just in the way of life that we invite people into, but in how we do church in general, from an attractional to a missional model. In addition to that, I'll throw out a couple other examples. Along that time, we were also processing the role of women in our church. Like I said earlier, when we started, me and some buddies took over, and we had an egalitarian kind of theological worldview. We always assumed that the fact that a few of us guys were kind of taking over, that would normalize over time. But after 15 years or so of leading our church, what started as a cute little band of brothers was eventually starting to feel like an impenetrable boys club. And so we had to ask ourselves what we were doing that was causing women to not be able to flourish as much as men in leadership. Thankfully, around that time, God positioned us with a consultant, a woman named Ellen Duffield, who runs a ministry called the Leadership Studio out of a summer camp in Northern Ontario called Muskoka Woods. And Ellen had done PhD level research on this and basically taught us two fundamental ideas. The first was that a woman's confidence, if not invested in intentionally, a woman's confidence naturally peaks at the age of 9. That it peaks at the age of 9. And from that point on, they begin to default very differently than men. They default to insecurity instead of confidence. In addition, women generally thrive in a very different kind of environment than men do, what she calls the courts. There's a male court and a female court. And so we realized that without making specific investments into the confidence of women and without making cultural changes to adapt to the court, we were forcing women to just thrive in what was already a predominantly man's world. And so all that led to launching two programs, one for our most senior women called Next Level Leadership, and the other for junior high girls from 6th to 8th grade called Brave Girls, to try to inject a confidence trajectory changing shape into their lives. And now over the last probably 8 or 10 years, we've seen a drastic difference in the flavor of female leadership in our church, where today our senior leadership, our board, they're largely mixed gender groups, where now the vision of spiritual moms and spiritual dads can parent the family together. Another innovation that's probably worth noting is just the journey of generational transfer itself. This is a photo of myself and our teaching pastor, Mike Krause, who together have led for almost a quarter century, but that's back when we played softball together as 10-year-old kids. Just the innovation or the idea of, instead of going down the road of search committees, to entrust the leadership of the church, to hand the keys of the family business over to some of the kids who'd grown up in it, I would say was an innovation. And the formal process that the generation beforehand kind of went through with our congregation to do that transfer of leadership with us, where now we find ourselves as a veteran generation of core leaders trying to do the very same thing, only as a much larger and more expansive community, to try to make that investment in 20-somethings and to hand the responsibilities and authorities of leadership over to them. So that gives you a bit of a flavor of the kind of things that I've been involved in the last 2 decades or so, and ways in which God has innovated among us. But like I said earlier, it doesn't really flow out of what I would believe to be leader creativity. It flows out of way more conviction. And so some core learnings from our perspective would be, first things first, to address issues with brutal honesty. To address issues with brutal honesty. At Apartment Life, Kelly called it feedback being a gift. Right? The Bible says that the truth will set you free. Often related to BCWI, we've discovered that facts are your friends. And what's been helpful for us has been facing those convicting moments with brutal honesty. If our church up and disappeared, would anyone notice? Have we become an impenetrable boys club that used to be a cute little band of brothers? You know, what is going to provide leadership for the future if we're failing on search committees? Time and time and time again, by just facing that harsh reality honestly, we've been able to stimulate a greater degree of innovation because of the conviction of it, more so than necessarily the creativity of it. from my perspective, the creativity of it flows out of then the next takeaway, and that is to not be satisfied with the definition of insanity. Some of you have heard the definition of insanity is doing the same things but expecting different results. Anytime we've been convicted by a harsh reality, by approaching it with brutal honesty, we've had to say, what are the different things we're going to do, or what are the ways in which we're going to do those things differently in order to get different results? The fact that we're facing reality honestly implies that we have to do something differently, and it forces us then to think and to strategize and to approach solutions outside of that box, which then requires, I would say, step 3 or ingredient 3 for us is the safety and the freedom to fail, or the opportunity to try in the first place, what Kelly in Apartment Life called the freedom to experiment. Our former pastor actually mentored us early on and said, hey, you can get away with anything if you call it an experiment. And what that does is it kind of creates the flexibility and the opportunity that this might not work out. And we've got dozens and dozens of things right now in our church community that we would label as experimental. The vast majority of them probably won't work. But by creating that culture, framing it as an experiment, it creates a safety to fail many times, but also to find those nuggets of innovation that are going to be effective for the long haul. One example of that, as I wrap up our story, would be in relation to our homeless shelter, where we were finding this kind of category of people. Once we got them housed, they were still struggling to spend their time in productive ways. They would come back to the shelter and they would try to stay connected with our community, but they were on government supports or whatever. They weren't capable of getting any meaningful employment. And so they weren't really sure what to do. And a few of the leaders in our homeless shelter, in combination with some people from our Vineland Anchor cause that serves the migrant farm workers, actually had this idea of a social enterprise where we got fruit supplied for us from these migrant farm owners, and we renovated the kitchen in our Vineland location to industrialize that kitchen so that we created a jam making program for former homeless shelter residents. And it gave them not only something to do, but it provided a productive job skill and life skill training environment that could help them build their resumes and get to the place where they could experience meaningful employment. And so now we're able to produce this high quality, we call it SOUTHRIDGE jam, spreading hope is the tagline, that we sell locally and online. We sell it to various markets and hotels and boutique shops here in the Niagara region, as well as online. It's also the free gift that we give new attenders at our church. But the SOUTHRIDGE Jam experience both develops homeless people in these life skills and whatever, and provides an opportunity to generate income and revenue that we reinvest into homelessness. And so now we can be creative and innovative in examples like this social enterprise, again, all because someone looked around and said, there's got to be a better way for these former residents to spend their time. What can we do differently to get different results? And can we try this in a way that is experimental and has the freedom to fail? In our experience, that's been what's driven innovation. It has way less to do with creativity than it does responding to conviction.
Wow, thanks, Jeff. Boy, that's fantastic. And looking forward to our question and answer time in a few minutes. But let's talk about the 3 steps to build innovation that also predicts a flourishing workplace culture, and especially as you and your organization look to accelerate past COVID. So let me just say the first one is to create a workplace culture that ensures employees can have frontline decision-making authority, to receive the information they need, to have access to continuous learning, and to be recognized for the innovation in the work they do, and to have the flexibility to address and solve problems in different ways. This is the first step. And again, I just love the stories that Kelly and Jeff have shared. You can see how they fit there. The second is to become an even better transformational leader that inspires and supports employees. I love Jeff's comments about just leading from conviction and particularly, that means modeling humility, fairness, integrity, to respect the creativity of employees, to inspire the team with vision and a path for the future. Inspiring and giving a vision is all part of that. Asking questions like Jeff was talking about. What if our church wasn't here? Who would miss it? And how that came about to really changing the focus to have 70% of the church's budget for justice and compassion kinds of ministries, to consider the individual needs of each person. The Jam Company is a great example of that, providing cognitive resources for people, or to look at the tasks that they do in different ways and suggest new ways to do work. And I especially like Kelly's example of, if you could say yes, how would we? And this gives people inspiration to think innovatively, to look forward at things, and to look at different angles, to prototype even faster. In the tech world, I have a daughter that works at Facebook. They use the term to encourage innovation and product design called an MVP. That's not most valuable player. That's a minimum viable product. The idea is to get a product out in the marketplace and to modify it as it's being used so that it becomes even more important and effective for the people that they're serving. Organizations that wait for a new service or product to be perfect before introducing it loses a lot of time. And Kelly was describing how that has worked as they've worked through the pandemic, and now have even experienced a record time. And then thirdly, build a culture of healthy communication and involves employees in the innovative process by seeking employee suggestions, acting on those suggestions. Kelly and Jeff talked about feedback as a gift. This is and listening, involving employees. I like Kelly's story. I've already said how they really get input, across the organization for strategic planning. And, I especially like what Jeff said about his point of brutal honesty. The truth will set you free. Speaking the truth and why decisions are made, and how that's just so helpful for employees who want to be engaged in the innovative process. So how about a couple of minutes here, and literally a couple of minutes to take some questions.
Kelly, Natalie is asking, what have you found is the best way to ask for feedback from employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate the advance notice as an internal processor. So yeah, we really consider BCWI like the Super Bowl of feedback. So how do we do it year round? So from a process, again, I'm a little more process wired. For us, and my role produces a lot of the proposals for innovation. And so I try to bake it in everywhere I can. So before I actually start proposing anything, I'll go to the people that it impacts and just say, tell me what's the problem, what's broken, if you could wave the wand, what would you do? And so I try to get feedback in the beginning. And then as proposals are developed, we try to review those with all the stakeholders that it's going to touch. Maybe not each individual person, but at least somebody who represents that group. And so being intentional to bake it in, I think, is super helpful. The more organic way, to Al's point, of just always listening, because people actually will make comments either in email or on a call or something, or feel frustrated. And so a lot of times we'll just say, hey, tell me more about that. And it really kind of draws them out. And even sometimes when you think they've given you the feedback, but you're pretty sure they're holding back, asking them like, okay, what's the last 10% that you might not be, willing to share, and just thanking them for the, courage to share all of that. So those are a couple more things that we do.
Brooklyn asks one more question. She says, how can organizations empower certain individuals out of sacred cow mentality and get people excited about innovation? Jeff, can you speak to that?
Speak to it my way, because in a lot of ways, we don't get people excited about innovation. We get honest about problem solving. That's what drives innovation for us. We don't have, a lot of blue sky. Wouldn't it be fun? Sort of those typical exercises that teams do to get creative juices flowing. We don't do a lot of that. What we do is stare reality in the face and say, how are we going to get out of this problem? That's what drives our innovation. So my question or my response to sacred cows, from my perspective, would be, I would keep a sacred cow sacred if it was working. It's as soon as the sacred cow isn't working that in our context, it would drive us to critique the sacred cow, unpack why it's not working, and unpack what we need to do differently, or what different things than the sacred cow we need to address in order to get different results. It's only when the sacred cow ain't so sacred that we would get into a conversation that would then lead to change and innovation.
Great. Anything else, Sarah? Yeah, great. Well, so really appreciate your questions, and we do need to move on. Thank you. So here's what we want to ask you. Is your organization ready to innovate, ready to face reality, as Jeff describes? Are you in a place where you're in a culture of innovation with high levels of employee engagement? So are you asking, how can I create a culture that inspires innovation? And our recommendation is to, first of all, build a flourishing workplace culture that encourages innovation. So here's our plan. And I'm just going to cover this at a high level. Here's a graphic in the next slide that is a brief summary of our approach to building a culture of innovation and a flourishing workplace. And it's similar to an approach Jeff and his team and Kelly and her team have used for the past several years. First is the discovery of the health of the organization's culture with an employee engagement survey. And then after the survey, the results are communicated broadly, and department leaders get their own results and begin to do the second step, and that's to build plans to innovate as a result of the employee feedback. And they look at it objectively with reality. They remember facts are our friends. They go forward and build plans. And the third step is to grow, and simply by implementing those action plans. And after a year, it's rinse and repeat, start over, discover again, because so much has changed even in a year's period of time. And what we found is, and this is our call to action, measure the level of your employee engagement and innovation in your organization today. And the first step is to develop your leadership's innovation muscles. And if you haven't measured the health of your workplace culture in the last 12 months, we encourage you to really start the cycle now. Begin the discovery phase, the first phase. And what's at stake? Well, we're going to go through a period of rapid change here in the next couple of months as the world comes out of COVID restrictions. And do you have the accurate pulse on the health of your workplace so that many of your employees, especially those that are working remotely? So those organizations that are innovative and are quick to return to health and growth as an organization, those are the ones that will do well. Others will stagnate and lose ground. And as the world opens up, employees will be looking for better opportunities as well. So we anticipate ministries and companies will be vulnerable to losing their best employees if they don't look at engagement and innovation. So again, the world needs Christ now more than ever. So thank you very much for watching. And for more information, don't hesitate to email me. Feel free to listen to one of our podcasts. Go search at the top for Kelly Jones or Jeff Lockyer, or just look at any topics that are interesting to you. So again, thanks so much for participating. This has really been a great pleasure. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Jeff. We appreciate, and to everybody that's participated, thanks for participating.